Bad blood. Black folks' historical mistrust of medical practice. Black folks' distrust of the healthcare system reaches as deep into our psyches as it does our history. That's no surprise since scientific reasoning has long been used to justify our racial humiliation. I chose to share with you the below quotes, one from Drylongzo, the masterpiece of African American anthropology by John Langston Gwaltney, and the other from Chris Rock's 1999 HBO Bigger and Blacker, because they both speak to our suspicion and dread of the white healthcare institutions and imply that those institutions have no commitment to healing or even helping Black people. There's a terrific new book on the subject called Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present by Harriet A. Washington, that I recommend if you'd like to go deeper into this sad history. And so our community doesn't trust professionals, focusing on the horrors committed against us and doubting the life-saving breakthroughs offered to us. So much so that the often new FDA-approved drugs are viewed as a form of social control. We are so skeptical that many of us simply turn to illegal drugs as a way of self-medicating and turn drug dealers into our street pharmacists. Take Deborah, a 25-year-old Ivy League graduate from a middle-class West Indian family. In the middle of the spring semester of her sophomore year, she began to suffer from crippling bouts of emotional numbness. She was unable to get out of bed, let alone complete assignments or keep what used to be an intense study schedule. A friend reported Deborah to the university's student health office after 2 weeks of this behavior. A counselor there gave Deborah an ultimatum. She either had to agree to attend weekly sessions for an hour, or news of her condition would be reported home to her parents.
It frightened me to death. I felt under enough pressure without my parents yelling at me about how I was throwing away my opportunity of a lifetime. I already constantly criticized myself about how it wasn't good enough. I could just hear my mother saying, "Maybe you don't belong up there with all those smart, rich white kids." Looking back, I guess I feared that was the case. Without her ever coming right out and saying it, I sent that same message to myself. Finally, I just started acting like it was true, like I didn't belong.
To avoid what Deborah feared would be her parents' wrath, she started going to the college's counseling center. At the beginning of the second session, the university therapist diagnosed her as suffering from antisocial personality disorder, what most folks call sociopath. Even though at the time most studies on the disorder were over 10 years old and about male prison inmates. The same therapist also wrote Deborah a low-dose prescription for the drug called phenytoin, found to be useful in treating antisocial personality. Yeah, that's right. A college girl at a top school was given a prescription drug only researched on inmates in the dark day of prison drug trials. Imagine something for a moment. 10 Black people come into an emergency room with 10 different kinds of injuries. One person has a broken leg, another has a cracked skull, another has a broken finger, and so on. All 10 of the patients are given the same size Band-Aid and told they are going to be fine. Sounds crazy, right? Now imagine 10 more Black people, all suffering from depression in varying degrees and forms, being prescribed the same medication. The horror of this scenario is that it happens all the time. It's what happened to Deborah.
After I went on the drugs, I was a total mess. Before I lay around thinking about how I was fucking up my life, then I couldn't think at all. Sure, I went to class because that's what I was supposed to do. Doing otherwise would have been breaking the rules. But it was just like someone stuck a vacuum in my brain and sucked me out.
You don't have to be a brain surgeon to figure out that a drug used on violent inmates might not be the best option for a peaceful young woman showing signs of depression. I can only imagine race played a large part. Did the color of Deborah's skin transform a young, overwhelmed woman into an angry inmate? Or did her doctor truly believe that the prescribed course of action was in the best interest of the patient, since the patient happened to be Black? Whatever the case, the consequences of Deborah's misdiagnosis were serious. Even though the drugs enabled her to remain in school, her inability to concentrate put her scholarship in danger, and there was no way to keep that from her parents.
I understand now that I should have left school for the duration of that semester. I was able to stay on because of the drug, but what good did that do to me?
In the end, none. Deborah's story made me think about how few entries there are in the American Psychological Association's historical documents for people of African descent, as well as Robert Whitaker's Mad in America and its description of early psychiatric diagnoses for African Americans. Quote, during the 19th century, the perceived mental health of African Americans was closely tied to their legal status as free men or slaves. Those who lived in free states or those who were slaves and publicly exhibited a desire to be free were at particular risk of being seen as insane. End quote. At one time in this country, it was an accepted belief that black people who wanted to be free were, by definition, out of their minds. Why?
John C. Calhoun, South Carolina Senator, Vice President under both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, white supremacist, passionate advocate of slavery, and intellectual forefather of the Confederate States of America, had this to say, quote, the African is incapable of self-care and sinks into lunacy under the burden of freedom. It is a mercy to give him guardianship and protection from mental health, end quote. That's right, the lawmakers of our newly formed country, besides being slaveholders, actually believed that freedom for our ancestors meant mental death. While slavery equaled protection, the so-called crazy desire of our foremothers and forefathers to be free was considered a disease with an actual name, drapetomania. Google the term and you'll be amazed at what you find. History doesn't get more relevant than that. It explains so much to us about where our negative attitudes towards psychiatry and psychology come from. First, our desire for freedom was considered a mental illness. Then the cure for this so-called disease was brutality, insofar as a good whipping could exorcise the devil from our bodies. If this was psychology, would it have to have been crazy not to fear it? The sad fact is that for too long, science served the interests of racism. Our so-called insanity was the product of policies used to either directly oppress us or at least explain how we were inferior. At the point where white healthcare institutions fail altogether or ignore us, our journey toward healing ends, killing off the possibility of a better self and a better life. Today, most of us are not in jeopardy of disappearing from the record books of our cities or states, but we're dying, and we're at risk of being emotionally and spiritually unavailable to ourselves, as well as absent in meaningful ways from lives of our families and communities.